Once again, thank you all so much for joining us today for the third part of our three-part training webinar. Today, we are going to be going over some of the bumblebee species that you may encounter in the Midwest, specifically the yellow, the northern amber, American, black and gold, yellow-banded, southern plains, and lemon cuckoo bumblebees. Before we jump into Bumblebee ID, I want to give you guys just a quick refresher on bumblebee anatomy. We'll be talking about lots of different parts of the bumblebee's body as we talk about ID. So I just wanted to remind you of what those major parts are. We can think of the bumblebee's body as being broken up into three sections: the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. On the head, we'll be talking a lot about the colors of the hair on the front of the face and the top of the head or vertex. On the thorax, we'll be talking quite a bit about the hairs in between the two wing joints, as well as the hairs underneath the wing joints. And then on the abdomen, we'll be talking a lot about the different segments of the abdomen, which are called tergites. Each one of these tergites has a label, T1 through T6, with T1 being the tergite that's closest to the thorax of the bumblebee. So if you are interested in bumblebee anatomy and you want to go into a little bit more depth on some of the terminology, I recommend that you check out our first webinar of the series where we really dive into bumblebee anatomy and the different terms you might encounter when you are learning about BID. But this little overview should get you through today. Jumping into our very first bumblebee, the yellow bumblebee. This is a species that you will encounter in most of the Midwestern United States. It's more commonly encountered in the northern Midwestern US, less so in the southern states, but you will see it occasionally in Kansas and Missouri. So this bumblebee is called the yellow bumblebee because the first thing that you see when you look at it is yellow. As I've mentioned in the past, I kind of like to work backwards when I'm doing BID. I like to look at the abdomen first, then the thorax and the head. And when you look at the abdomen of this bee, you just see so much yellow. T1, T2, T3, T4 are going to be yellow for the females of this species. The tail of the bumblebee will be black. And then looking to the thorax, you will see mostly, again, yellow. There will be a narrow black band between the two wing joints, but the hairs underneath the wing joints are going to be yellow. And then looking at the head of the bumblebee, for the females, you're going to see black hairs on the top of the head and on the front of the face. The males look very similar to the females. Once again, if you look at the abdomen of the males, you're going to be seeing a lot of yellow. T1 through 5 will be yellow. You will also often see yellow on T6, especially right in the middle of T6. There will often be a section of yellow hairs. And then the tip of the abdomen will be black, generally. The thorax will be yellow for this bumblebee species, with a black band of hairs between the two wing joints. Once again, this black band is typically pretty narrow for the males. And then on the head, on the front of the face and the top of the head, you'll be seeing mostly black hairs. So diving into some examples, here we have a really nice example of a female yellow bumblebee. Once again, it just looking at nothing but yellow pretty much here. T1 through 4 is going to be yellow for the females. You can see that clearly in both of these pictures. The thorax is mostly yellow, and you can see a narrow black band of hairs between the two wing joints. This black band looks a little bit wide in this photo here, and that's because this bee has lost some hair. So if you look closely, you can see that there's some missing hairs there, and that's what's giving it that sort of wider shape. But the actual band of hairs themselves is quite narrow. And then you can also see that this bee has black hairs on the front of the face and top of the head. For the males, similar color patterning, mostly yellow on the abdomen. T4 or T1 through 5 on this bee is yellow. It's really hard to see from this photo, but there's also a few yellow hairs on T6 right in the middle on this individual. The thorax is mostly yellow with that narrow black band between the two wing joints. And then this bee also has black hairs on the top of the head and front of the face, although it's not visible from this photo. Right. The yellow bumblebee looks quite similar to the northern amber bumblebee. So this is another bumblebee species that is really yellow in coloration. This is a species that you're mostly going to be finding in the upper Midwest, so North Dakota, Minnesota, maybe a little bit in South Dakota as well. And this bumblebee is called the northern amber bumblebee because, as I just mentioned, you'll find it in the north and it's quite amber or golden in color. Yellow bumblebee tends to be a little yellower. This one is a little bit more ambery, brownish yellow in contrast. But it is a very yellowish toned bee. It has lots of yellow on the abdomen, so T1 through 4 is going to be that yellow or amber color. T5 through 6 is going to be black on the females. Looking at the thorax, their thorax is mostly yellow. There's yellow before the wings and yellow behind the wings, but there's going to be a very wide black band between the two wing joints of black hairs. And then there are also going to be black hairs underneath the wing joints as well. And then the hairs on this bee species for the females are going to be yellow on the front of the face and top of the head. We see a very similar color pattern for the males. So male northern amber bumblebees are going to be mostly yellow on the abdomen. T1 through 4 is going to be yellow, and then T5 through 7 can be black or yellow, or a combination of black and yellow. Looking at the thorax, once again, similar color patterning to the females. There's yellow in front of the wings, yellow behind the wings. There's a wide black band of hairs between the two wings, and then black hairs underneath the wings. And then, like the females, they will have yellow hairs on the top of their head and front of their face. Looking at some examples of northern amber bumblebees, here we have a really nice set of photos of a female northern amber bumblebee. The first thing that really jumps out to me is how profuse those yellow hairs on the front of the face and top of the head are on this bee. So that's something to really look out for this bee species. The next thing to look at are the colors on the thorax and abdomen. This bee has yellow on 1, 2, 3, and 4 segments of the abdomen, and then the thorax is yellow with a wide band of black hairs between the wing bases, and then lots of black hairs underneath the wing joints. Looking at a male of this species, once again, this bee is very yellow. This bee has yellow hairs on every segment of its abdomen, I think maybe with the exception of T7. It has a mostly yellow thorax with a wide black band of hairs between the two wing joints and then dark hairs underneath the wing joints. And then you can see that it has yellow hairs on the top of its head, and that the hairs on the face are a mixture of yellow and, or I would say mostly gray and black. But there are some light hairs on the front of the face as well. All right, so as you can imagine, folks get the yellow and northern amber bee mixed up all the time. They do look really similar to each other. So the first thing that you're going to want to look out for on this bee species is the hair color on the face. So on the yellow bumblebee, they're going to have yellow hairs, or on the yellow bumblebee, they're going to have black hairs on the top of the head and front of the face. On the northern amber bee, those hairs are going to be yellow on the top of the head and front of the face. The second thing to look at is the hair color underneath the wing joints. For both the males and females of these species, the yellow bumblebee is going to have mostly yellow hairs underneath the wing joints, and then the northern amber bumblebee is going to have dark hairs underneath the wing joints. Next bumblebee on the docket is the American bumblebee, Bombus pensylvanicus. This is a bumblebee species that you will see quite often in the Midwestern United States, although you won't see it in northern Minnesota or northern North Dakota. This is a darker bumblebee. So looking first at the abdomen, this bumblebee has dark hairs on T1. So T1 will be dark with a fringe of yellow hairs at the bottom, or some yellow hairs just in the center of that segment of the abdomen towards the bottom. And then T2 and T3 will be yellow, and the rest of the abdomen will be black. The thorax of this bee is also quite dark, so they will have yellow hairs in front of the wings, but then they will have a very wide band of dark hairs and dark hairs underneath the wing joints. And then you will often see dark hairs behind the wings as well, although sometimes you will see some yellow hairs in there too. So it just kind of depends on the individual you're looking at, how many yellow hairs are behind the wing joints. And then the hairs on the front of the face and on the top of the head for this species are going to be black. The males of the species tend to be yellower than the females, especially on the abdomen. So looking at the abdomen of the males, T1 will often be entirely yellow, though sometimes it will be half yellow and half black, just like the females. T2 through 4 will be yellow, and then T5 and 6 will be black or yellow, just kind of depending on the individual. One thing to really look out for males of this species is an orange tip of the tail. So lots of the time, males will have some orange hairs or lots of orange hairs at the very end of their abdomen. And that's not true in all cases, but you'll see it pretty often. Looking at the thorax, once again, very similar color patterning to the females. They will have yellow in front of the wings, and then behind the wings and in between the wings, that you will see lots of dark hairs. So they'll have a wide band of black hairs between the wing joints, black hairs below the wing joints, and then sometimes they will have yellow hairs behind the wing joints, or sometimes they'll have an intermix of yellow and black hairs behind the wing joints. Looking at the head, the hairs on the top of the head and the front of the face for males will also be black. So looking at some examples, females of this species, here we have a really nice female American bumblebee. You can see, looking at the thorax, that it is mostly dark. She has yellow hairs in front of her wings, but we see a really nice wide black band between the two wing joints, black hairs underneath the wing joints, and then a mixture of yellow and black hairs behind the wing joints, which you can really see in this second photo here. Looking at the abdomen of this bee has half black, half yellow on T1. And just for those of you who aren't as familiar with Bumblebee ID, that's that area marked out by the red box. You can see that the top half of that segment is black, bottom half is yellow. T1 or T2 and T3 on this bee are yellow, and then the rest of the abdomen is black. In the second photo, you can clearly see that she has dark hairs on the top of her head and front of her face. Here is a nice example of a male of this species. We see that the abdomen on this bee is mostly yellow on T1, T2, T3, T4, has some yellow hairs on T5, and then if you look really closely, you can see a few orange hairs on the very tip of that abdomen. Looking at the thorax, very similar color patterning to the female that we just looked at. Yellow hairs before the wings, black hairs behind, with some intermixing of yellow and black hairs at the very back of the thorax. This individual has dark hairs on the top of the head and then an intermix of yellow and black hairs on the front of the face, which you'll see sometimes in the males. Right. So just pointing out those key things to look out for on this species. You want to look for black hairs mixed on the sides, black hairs mixed in on the sides of the thorax, and then orange hairs on the very tip of that abdomen. All right, so American yellow and northern amber males can be really easy to mix up with one another, so I just want to go through some main things to look out for when you're trying to differentiate these three species, particularly for males of these three species. So the first thing you want to check on males of what you think could be one of these is the top of the head. For American and yellow bumblebees, they are going to have black hairs on the top of their head. The northern amber bumblebee will have yellow hairs on the top of their head. The next thing to look at is the amount of black that you're seeing on the thorax. So American and northern amber bumblebees will have pretty wide bands of black hairs between the two wing joints, and they will also have black hairs underneath those wing joints. In contrast, yellow bumblebees will have more yellow on their thorax. Their band of black will typically be narrower between the two wing joints, and they will have yellow hairs underneath those wing joints. All right, the last thing to check for is the color on the tip of the abdomen. As I mentioned previously, lots of American bumblebee males will have orange hairs on the very tip of their abdomen. For yellow and northern amber males, they will have black hairs or yellow hairs. All right, on to the next bumblebee on our docket, the black and gold bumblebee, Bombus auricomus. So this is a bumblebee species that looks a lot like the American bumblebee, which we just went over, and it also has a lot of range overlap with the American bumblebee. It is another species that you'll find quite often in the midwestern United States, with the exception of northern North Dakota and Minnesota. So it's called the black and gold bumblebee because it is black and gold. On the abdomen, you will see T1 being black or mostly black. T2 and T3 will be yellow, and then T4 and 6 will be black on the females. On the thorax of females, we generally see yellow in front of the wings, a black stripe in between the wings, as well as dark hairs underneath the wing joints. And then you will often see some yellow behind the wings, although sometimes you'll encounter individuals that are entirely black behind the wings. So they also have a really dark thorax compared to some other species. The last thing to look at is the hair colors on the top of the head and front of the face. American bumblebees will generally have yellow hairs on top of their head, although sometimes there won't be that many yellow hairs, so there'll just be a few. And then they have black hairs on the front of their face. The males of this species are pretty distinct looking. So the first thing that I notice when I see a black and gold bumblebee male isn't the color patterning as much as it is the sort of shape of its body. These guys are really round and sort of fly-like in appearance. They have really huge eyes and really stubby little antennae and sort of roundish bodies that makes them look a lot like flies to me. But you know, they also have very similar color patterning to the females. Looking at the abdomen, T1 will be yellow or partly yellow, T2 and T3 will be yellow, and then the rest of the abdomen will be black. They will have a black stripe or spot in between the two wings, and then their head will have yellow hairs on the front of the face and top of the head. So looking at some examples of black and gold bumblebees, here we have a really nice example of a female of this species. This one has a little bit more yellow hairs than the other photo that was on the slide before. So this bee has lots of yellow hairs at the back of the thorax and some yellow hairs on T1. So just sort of things to look out for this species. You're going to expect to see mostly dark hairs on T1 with occasionally you'll encounter an individual like this one with some yellow hairs on the very sides of that segment of the abdomen, sort of towards the bottom. And then you'll see yellow on T2, yellow on T3, and then the rest of the abdomen will be black. Looking at the thorax will be darker generally. There will be light hairs before the wing joints. And on this individual, as I mentioned, this one also has lots of light hairs behind the wing joints as well. Although you will get individuals who have just sort of a little crescent of yellow hairs back there or no yellow hairs at all. And then this individual has lots of yellow hairs on the top of its head, and then black hairs mostly on the front of its face. Looking at an example male of this species, so we have here an individual that has some yellow hairs on T1, yellow hairs on T2, and yellow hairs on T3, and then mostly dark beneath that, or all black hairs beneath that. The thorax of this bee has a stripe of dark hairs, although sometimes you'll get some individuals with more of a spot of dark hairs in between the wing joints for the males. And then in this photo, you can really see those gigantic eyes. So it's pretty easy to get black and gold and American bumblebees mixed up. They look really similar to each other in terms of color patterning. They're also both really large bees. So at a glance, sometimes you think that you've caught an American and you look at it closely and you're like, oh, this is a black and gold, actually. Because there are a couple things that you just want to look out for when differentiating these two species. The first thing you want to look out for is the hair colors on the top of the head. Black and gold bumblebees have yellow hairs on the top of their head, whereas American bumblebees have black hairs. And as I mentioned previously, sometimes there won't be that many black hairs or yellow hairs on the black and gold bumblebees on the top of their head. Sometimes there'll just be a few hairs there. So it depends on the individual you're looking at, but that's the first thing that I look out for when I'm trying to separate these. The second thing I like to check is the patterning of the hair color on that first segment of the abdomen. So for black and gold bumblebees, they're going to have an entirely black T1. Sometimes you'll see some yellow hairs on the very edges or margins of that segment, but in the center, those hairs will all be black. And sometimes they'll be a little bit bald there too. For the American bumblebee, in contrast, they will have a fringe or stripe of yellow hairs all the way across the bottom of that segment of the abdomen, or they will have concentrated yellow hairs sort of in the center towards the bottom, and then it will be black on the side. So it just depends on the individual, but you're going to want to look for those yellow hairs in the center of that segment for the American bumblebees, and then a lack of yellow hairs for the black and gold. All right, so for these two species, it's really important to get a picture of the abdomen with the wings spread out so you can see the very center of that segment of the abdomen. For the males, the males are hard to mix up with other bumblebee species just because they have those giant eyes. Lots of males of other bumblebee species don't have those huge eyes. So here we have a black and gold male, and here we have an American bumblebee male. And although black and gold and American females are really easy to mix up, the males aren't because just those huge eyes are so apparent. There are a couple species that you will encounter in the region that have large eyes as well. For example, the brown-belted bumblebee male also has really large eyes. So for there, you just want to check the color patterning of the bee that you've caught. The brown-belted bumblebee will have a brown crescent on T2 and yellow on T1, whereas the black and gold bumblebee will have yellow hairs on T1, T1, T2, and T3. So looking at T3, no yellow hairs on the brown-belted bumblebee, some yellow hairs on the black and gold. All right, next bumblebee that we have on the docket for today is the yellow-banded bumblebee, Bombus terricola. So this is a bumblebee species that is also quite dark. It has mostly black on its thorax and a similar color patterning to the American and black and gold bumblebee on the abdomen. But there are a few key differences to look out for. The first thing that I always like to check out is sort of the general size of the bee. So this bumblebee tends to be smaller than the black and gold and American bumblebee. It's also very round and cute. It's very round, especially on the abdomen, and we'll go through some pictures that really showcase that in a little bit here. And then also you want to be thinking about where you're located geographically when you're separating out these species. The yellow-banded bumblebee is a species that you're going to be finding mostly in the northern part of the Midwestern US. So northern Minnesota, northern North Dakota. There's not a ton of overlap in range between the species and the black and gold and American bumblebees. So this is one to really only watch out for if you are in these states. All right, so looking at the color patterning on this species on the abdomen, it's going to have black on T1, T2 through 4 will be yellow, T5 and 6 will be black, although sometimes you'll see this yellow or white fringe of hairs on T5. The thorax will be mostly black with yellow in front of the two wings, and then the hairs on the front of the face and top of the head will be black. Right, and this is the color patterning for females. For males, they have a really similar color patterning. T1 will be black on males, T2 and 4 will be yellow. The tail can be black, or sometimes it will also have a few yellow hairs as well, just like the females. The thorax of this bee is generally black with yellow hairs before the wings, and then the hairs on the top of the head and front of the face can be black or yellow or an intermix of those colors. Looking at some examples of females, in this photo you can really see how round this bee is. I just think that they're so cute. In my opinion, oh, oops, sorry. This should say yellow-banded bumblebee, not American bumblebee. But this is a yellow-banded bumblebee. And in my opinion, they're just the cutest bees that you will encounter. I've actually never seen one in person, but I hope I will next year. Because yeah, they're one of my favorite bumblebees to look at. And so here you can really see the color patterning of this individual. She has a mostly black thorax with yellow in front of the wings, black on T1, yellow on T2 and T3. And then in this photo, you can see that fringe of lighter hairs there on T5 as well. Looking at a male of this species, once again, very similar color patterning to the females. Black on T1, yellow on T2 and T3, mostly black on the rest of the abdomen, although this individual also has some lighter hairs on the tip. The thorax of this bee is dark with yellow hairs in the front, and then this individual has some yellow hairs on the top of the head and in the front of the face. So, as you can imagine, it can be easy to mix up yellow-banded bumblebees with the other darker bees that you may encounter in the regions that you're in. So the first thing as I mentioned earlier, that I like to look out for is just sort of the general shape of the bee. Yellow-banded bumblebees have sort of a shorter, rounder looking abdomen compared to the American bumblebee and the black and gold bumblebee, which tend to be a lot longer looking. Especially the American bumblebee, they can be quite spindly in shape. The American and black and gold bumblebees are also very large, and you can't really see it in the photos, but these are big bees compared to the yellow-banded bumblebee, which is smaller. You also want to check the color patterning of these species, especially the hairs on the top of the head. So for the black and gold bumblebee, you would expect to see some yellow hairs on the top of the head. For American and yellow-banded, you would not see yellow hairs there. And then you also are going to want to check what's going on T1. Black and gold bumblebees will often have a black T1, but sometimes they'll have some yellow hairs on T1 at the very sides, and you can see that in this photo. American bumblebees will have that stripe of yellow hairs on T1 at the bottom, and then yellow-banded bumblebees will have black hairs on T1. You also want to check for that little fringe of light hairs on the tip of the abdomen for yellow-banded bumblebees. That's a good cue that you're looking at a yellow-banded bumblebee. These bees also tend to be a little bit fluffier looking, especially their hairs on the top of the head look quite fluffy compared to the hairs on the American bumblebee and the black and gold. The next bumblebee that we have on the docket is the southern plains bumblebee, Bombus fraternus. And looking at the sort of cartoon image of this bee, it doesn't look incredibly distinct. There are some other bee species that look like that cartoon for sure that we've been through already, but this bee is actually really unique looking when you see it in the field. It has really neat, close-cropped hairs that give it sort of a velvety appearance, and then the hairs on the abdomen, which you can't really see in this photo, but you will see in some of the examples that I show you after this, is very slicked back in appearance. They lay almost flat against the bee's abdomen, and so it kind of gives their abdomen a sort of flattish shape. So yeah, very distinct looking bees when you see them in the field. This bee is called the southern plains bumblebee because you find it in the southern plains. Right, so you're not going to really see it in Minnesota hardly ever. You're not going to see it in North Dakota. But you will see it sort of in the southern extent of the Midwest. This species is threatened. It has actually been petitioned for listing as an endangered species relatively recently, so a species that we're really interested in. Looking at the color patterns for this bee, the abdomen is going to be yellow on T1 and T2, and then T3 through 6 is going to be black on the females. The thorax will be yellow with a yellow stripe between the two wings, and then yellow beneath. The last thing I like to look for is the shape of the head. This bee has shorter cheeks than some of the other species you may encounter, and it gives them sort of a roundish looking head. Males have a very similar color patterning to the females. They have yellow on T1 and T2 of the abdomen. T3 through 6 will be black. They have a yellow stripe or spot between the wings and then yellow on their thorax. And then they have black or yellow hairs on the top of the head or front of the face. Once again, the males of the species looked very distinct because they have sort of a flattish looking abdomen, and you can really see that here in this photo. It almost looks like the abdomen of this bee has gotten squished a little bit. And that's because the hairs on the abdomen lie really flat against it. So looking at some examples of individuals of this species, we have first off a female bumblebee, and you can see clearly that she has yellow hairs on T1 and yellow hairs on T2 of the abdomen. The rest of the abdomen is black. Looking at the thorax, we see that it is yellow with a stripe of black between the two wing joints and then black hairs underneath the wing joints. And from this photo, you can also really clearly see how short her hairs are on the thorax. It almost gives her a very velvety look, especially at the front of the thorax there. And then looking at the abdomen, you can see how flat those hairs are against the abdomen, giving it sort of that flattish looking shape. And you can see that it almost looks like those hairs have been slicked back against the abdomen. Looking at the males of this species, similar color patterning to the females, yellow on T1, yellow on T2, dark hairs all the way down. This guy has a little bit of a weird cowlick of yellow there on T3, but that's just a little bit of individual variation. This bee has yellow hairs on the thorax. This guy has more of a spot in between the two wing joints as opposed to a band, but you'll see both for males of this species. And then you can see this one has some yellow hairs on the top of the head, not so much on the front of the face. For the females, the bee that I get mixed up with it the most often is the black and gold. So once in a while, you'll encounter a black and gold female that has lots of yellow hairs on the back of the thorax, and every so often I've thought for 1 second that it could be a Southern Plains bumblebee. So when you're differentiating these two species, what you really want to look out for is the hair color patterning on T1, T2, and T3. For black and gold, they'll have black on T1, yellow on T2, and yellow on T3. Whereas the Southern Plains females will have yellow on T1, yellow on T2, and then black the rest of the way down. Right, and then also you are going to be wanting to look for that sort of just general shape of the abdomen. The Southern Plains bumblebees have that flattish looking abdomen that's so distinct. Looking at the males, similar things you want to look out for. What is going on those first 3 segments of the abdomen. For black and gold bumblebees, you will see yellow hairs on T1, 2, and 3. For the Southern Plains, you're just going to be seeing yellow hairs on T1 and T2. The Southern Plains bumblebees, I forgot to mention this earlier, but they also have really large eyes. You can kind of see it in this picture here. So they are a species that you may potentially get mixed up with black and gold bumblebees. Another thing to look out for is the length of the face. These are actually 2 female bumblebees. That's a typo there. But for Southern Plains and black and gold bumblebees, they have really different face shapes because the cheek lengths are quite different. Black and gold bumblebees have a really long face. The Southern Plains bumblebee, in contrast, has a shorter face, which gives it a sort of rounder looking appearance. And I know that it can be really hard to tell the difference just by glancing, so I've marked out here in red the lengths of those cheeks for you. You can see the black and gold bumblebee has a really long cheek. The Southern Plains bumblebee has a shorter cheek. All right, for the next section of this talk, I want to talk about how you differentiate between cuckoo bumblebees and non-cuckoo bumblebees. So far in our webinar series, we've only covered bumblebees that aren't cuckoo bumblebees. And cuckoo bumblebees are bumblebees with a parasitic lifestyle. So these are the bees that are going to be, rather than establishing their own colonies, trying to co-opt the colonies of other bumblebee species. So for cuckoo bumblebees, you're never going to see any workers. You are only going to be seeing the females and males, but you'll never see smallish workers. So something to keep in mind when you are doing ID for this group. So the first thing that you should be checking when you think something could be a cuckoo bee is for a pollen basket for the females. So cuckoo bumblebee females, they don't have pollen baskets because they have that parasitic lifestyle where they are stealing the colonies of other bumblebee species. They don't have to collect any of their own pollen. So they don't have those structures on their legs where they need to be packing their pollen. So their midsection of their hind leg is going to be hairy all the way across. In contrast, for our non-cuckoo bumblebee species, they will have pollen baskets in that middle section of their hind leg that will be bald where they will be packing their pollen. And it's also going to be really triangular in shape. They'll have a nice triangle there for them to pack their pollen in. The second thing to look out for when differentiating cuckoo bumblebees from non-cuckoo bumblebees is the sparseness of the hair on their bodies. So cuckoo bumblebees tend to have sparser hair on their abdomens. If you look at this photo here, you can see right down to the cuticle underneath the hairs. Like it almost looks like this bee is balding because the hairs are so sparse. In contrast, for non-cuckoo bumblebees, their hairs are going to be much denser. You can't really see down to the cuticle underneath the hairs for this bee. That's pretty typical for non-cuckoos. The next thing I like to look out for cuckoo bumblebees and non-cuckoo bumblebees is how curved and tapered the abdomen is, especially at the tip. So for cuckoo bumblebees, they're really built for battle. They fight to the death with a non-cuckoo bumblebee in order to co-opt the nest. And so they just have an abdomen that is like ready to sting other bees. It's very curved. It tapers quite a lot at the end. When you are comparing it to another bumblebee species that's not a cuckoo, you can really see that their abdomen is not quite as curved. And this is also true not just for the females, but for the males. Often when you see a male cuckoo bumblebee, they'll have a little bit of a curve in their abdomen as well compared to the non-cuckoo bumblebees. And it's not quite as obvious, but there is a bit of a curve there. All right, the last thing to check for both the males and females when you are looking to see whether or not you have a cuckoo bumblebee is how thick their head is. And what I mean by that is what is the distance between the eye and the area of the head where the head attaches to the thorax. For non-cuckoo bumblebees, this space will not be very long. For cuckoo bumblebees, it will be pretty long. So they have a very thick looking head. Oops. All right, so I think that I probably only have time today to go through one cuckoo bumblebee species in detail. So I thought I would focus on the lemon cuckoo bumblebee, which is one of the cuckoo bumblebees that you will find most often in the Midwest. So this is a cuckoo species that you'll see quite often in Minnesota, not so much in other states. But of all the cuckoo bumblebee species, it's one that I think we generally see the most often. So looking at the color patterning of this bee, lemon cuckoo bumblebees generally have more dark hairs on their abdomens, although you will get some lighter individuals. So a typical color pattern that you will see for lemon cuckoo bumblebees is black on T1 and T2, some yellow hairs on T3, and then black on T4, T5, and T6. And you will encounter individuals that are a bit lighter sometimes. Sometimes you'll see individuals with lots of yellow hairs on T1. Just kind of depends on the individual that you have in hand. The most important thing to focus on for the abdomen is how much yellow hair you're seeing on T3. Cuckoo bumblebees will generally have their yellow hairs concentrated on T3. And sometimes you'll see an individual that has almost a completely black abdomen with just a few yellow hairs sort of on the sides of that segment. The thorax for this bee will be yellow or almost completely yellow, with a little tiny dot of black in the center. And then on the head, they will have black hairs on the front of the face and then yellow hairs on the top of the head. The males look a little different than the females. For this species, generally, you will see males with yellow on T1, T2, and T3. And then you will see black hairs on T4 and T5. Sometimes you will encounter an individual without that many yellow hairs on T3, and they'll just have yellow hairs on T1 and T2. So something to look out for there. The thorax of this bee for the males will be yellow with a sort of T or thumbtack shape of black in between the two wing joints. And then on the head, their hairs will be black on the front of the face and yellow on the top of the head. So just looking at a few examples of females of this species, here we have a nice example of a female. We see that her thorax is mostly yellow, although she does have a little dot of black in between the two wing joints. This bee also has mostly yellow hairs concentrated on T3, whereas most of the abdomen is black, although there are a few yellow hairs on T1 as well. And then on both of these photos, you can see that the hairs on the top of the head are yellow and then the hairs on the front of the face are black. Looking at an example of a pretty typical male, we see that this individual has T1, T2, and T3 completely yellow. The rest of the abdomen is black. As I mentioned previously, sometimes you'll get individuals that have black on T3, and then sometimes you'll get some individuals that have a few yellow hairs on the edges of T4. So just to look out for, sometimes you'll see some variation in the males of the species. This male also has a nice band or a T-shape or sort of triangle shape of black hairs between the two wing joints, which is typical for this species, mostly yellow on the thorax. And this individual has light hairs on the top of the head and then black hairs on the front of the face. You can kind of see it in this photo. You can kind of tell that the head of this bee is kind of thick looking. It almost looks like somebody plopped their head right on the thorax. It doesn't have that sort of flattish look that some of the males of other non-cuckoo bumblebee species have. So just a tip for differentiating lemon cuckoo bumblebees and rusty patch bumblebee males. Every once in a while, folks will get lemon cuckoo bumblebee males mixed up with rusty patch males, especially for those cuckoos that only have yellow on T1 and T2. This guy has yellow on T3, but as I mentioned previously, sometimes you'll see individuals without yellow on T3. And I think the reason that people get them mixed up is because rusty patch males and lemon cuckoo bumblebee males both have sort of a T shape of dark hairs in between the two wing joints. So when you are trying to differentiate these species, you want to look out for those things that differentiate cuckoo bumblebees from other non-bumblebees species in general. So you want to be looking and checking, is the head really thick looking? Does it have sort of a curved appearance on the abdomen? And then for lemon cuckoo bumblebees, you're also going to be wanting to check where those yellow hairs extend to. Do you see yellow hairs on T3 or not? I just wanted to make sure that you are aware that there are other cuckoo bumblebees that you could encounter in the region that aren't the lemon cuckoo bumblebee. Just a good general rule of thumb when you think that you could have a cuckoo bumblebee in hand is make sure that you're checking for those features of cuckoo bumblebees. Are you seeing pollen basket or are you seeing a hairier leg for the females? Is the head really thick looking? Are you seeing a really curved abdomen? There are also some sort of general rules of thumb for cuckoo bumblebee females that you will encounter in this region. The first being that cuckoo bumblebee females generally, as sort of a trend, will often have darker abdomens. Their dark hairs or the dark hairs are really concentrated towards the front of the abdomen, whereas if you see light hairs, you will often see them sort of at the end of the abdomen. So on T3, T4, as opposed to T1 and T2, where you see light hairs on sort of the non-cuckoo bumblebee species. The other thing to look out for as a general rule of thumb is where you're seeing the yellow hairs concentrated on the abdomen. Are you seeing them on the sides of the abdomen, or are you seeing them more in the middle? Because for a lot of cuckoo bumblebees, you will see a concentration of yellow hairs on the sides of the abdomen. For non-cuckoo bumblebees, you'll often see yellow hairs more in the middle. We did not cover during this webinar series every single bumblebee species that you could encounter in some areas of the US. So, we covered all of the species that you'll find in Missouri and almost all of the species that you'll find in Iowa. We didn't cover all the species you could find in Minnesota or the Dakotas or Nebraska. So I wanted to point you guys out to a few other nice resources for Bumblebee ID, specifically an identification guide to bumblebees of North America. This is one of my favorite books for bee ID. It has all of the bumblebee species that you could potentially encounter in North America, and I use it all the time when I'm trying to do ID in the field and from photos. The other resource that I often will use is Bumblebees of the Eastern United States. This is a free PDF that you can find online. And it is a really great reference for some of the variability that you see in different sort of color patterns for bumblebees in the East. It doesn't cover every single bumblebee that you'll find in sort of the Western Midwest. For that, you would want to reference Bumblebees of the Western United States, which covers bumblebees in the West. Unfortunately, we don't have a Bumblebees of the Midwestern United States, although maybe someday we'll have a document like for that. But both of these documents cover any bumblebees you could find in the Midwest. You just have to kind of put them together. I also want to give a shout out to the ID webinar course that our partners at University of Minnesota put on. Elaine Evans holds a course every year on Midwestern bee ID that goes into much more depth than what we've covered in our webinar series. I think in total it's about 8 hours of content. They really dive into cuckoo bumblebee ID as well as ID for some of the rare species that you would find in Minnesota. And their focus really is on Minnesota's bumblebees, but there's a ton of overlap, obviously, between Minnesota and the rest of the Midwest. So definitely something I suggest checking out if you are interested in learning more about bumblebee ID in general, really brushing up and getting an excellent sense of bumblebee ID in your region. All right, and then before I wrap up, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the supporters of the Xerces Society. We are an organization that is only possible because of our members. If any of our members are out there in the audience, I just wanted to give you a shout out and say thank you so much for supporting our work. It wouldn't be possible without you. We are also supported by a number of different organizations. And I also wanted to acknowledge our Atlas partners in the Midwest as well. We have on our webinar today some of our partners from Mizzou and from University of Minnesota. And we partner with lots of other organizations in the Midwestern United States to make the Atlas possible. So thank you all for your support as well. All right, and I think that covers everything I had for today. And it looks like we have some time for questions.
Yeah, there was a question. I accidentally clicked answer live instead of typing it, but there's a question about cuckoo bumblebees versus carpenter bees, and what the difference there is. I don't know if you wanted to cover that, Jenny.
Yeah, I think that that is an excellent question. Very frequently, we'll have folks take a photo of a carpenter bee and submit it as a bumblebee because they are very similar looking to bumblebees. Um, I guess off the top of my head, the first thing I look out for carpenter bees is sort of the shape of the head. Carpenter bees have a really distinct looking head shape, and their eye positioning just looks a little bit different to me than a non-cuckoo bumblebee or a cuckoo bumblebee. Like their head is I don't know how to describe it, maybe more squat. Let me see if I can pull up a photo really quick.
Yeah, it's sort of like if you take a bumblebee head and squish it down a little, like it gets wider. It just looks different. If you have the two right in front of you, it's very easy to see the difference, but without a photo, it's kind of hard if you're just trying to imagine it.
Yeah, I think leg wise, like they both won't have orbicula, but the carpenter bee will have like really, really densely hairy, where the orbicula would be, whereas the cuckoo probably won't. It'll be a little more sparse, but that's one that probably shows up better in pictures. And it's like, yeah, again, it's hard without pictures because they are so similar, but
I'm not super familiar with the carpenter bees because we don't really have them in Minnesota, but the thing that I would look for the most is the shiny abdomens on the carpenter bees compared to the bumblebees.
Yeah, the shiny abdomen is a good one. I think one of the things that we usually say when we're describing cuckoo bumblebees is that the hair on the abdomen is sparse, right? There's not as much hair as a typical bumblebee, but compared to a carpenter bumblebee, like there's still obvious hairs on the cuckoo bumblebee. Like when you look at a carpenter bee, it pretty much only has hair on that first segment, and then the rest is very shiny, sometimes iridescent looking. Like they're very distinct side by side, but if you're only looking at one or the other, it can be hard when you're learning to see the two features.
Okay, I have a or not a cuckoo bumblebee, carpenter bee queued up from Bumblebee Watch if you guys want to take a look at what some of the things that we're talking about. So, do you guys see that?
Yep.
Awesome. So yeah, so as folks were mentioning, they have really sparse hairs on their abdomen, right? That is a very shiny looking abdomen compared to some of the bumblebees that we've seen. Their head also is just kind of fat. Like it looks like a little dumpling with two eyes stuck on, like a bow or something. And it's like it's bigger than they're like a cartoon bumblebee. It's just a little bit bigger looking. And then also they don't have a dark hairs on their thorax. They just have kind of a baldish spot. Their hair is a little bit shorter looking too, than you would see for a bumblebee. And their T1 is also just sort of a different shape. Like it's not bumblebee shaped. They also have these sort of like bottle brush legs. You can see that right here. They look like bottle brushes, like you would get for like cleaning an infant's baby bottle. They don't have like that segment of the leg is sort of round. For bumblebees, it's a little flatter looking, even for I would say even for the cuckoo bumblebees. Um, yeah, and
Yeah.
then you can again see that baldness on the abdomen. And then yeah, just how thick that little dumpling head is.
Hey Jenny, while
So,
you're on Bumblebee Watch or maybe one of your slides, somebody just asked about seeing pollen sacs on female bumblebees. Can
oh yeah.
you what to look for on the legs and where?
All right, let's look for some females. Let's try to find one with pollen. This, oops, nope.
Well, we can maybe show an empty one if there's a good photo, because the word that Jared was using was corbicula, which Jenny used a lot too. If you're not familiar with that word, that's basically the segment on the leg where they store the pollen. It's like a hollowed out basket. So that's where they're going to store these pollen sacs, if you will.
Right. Can you guys see my screen still? I can't
Yep.
remember if I turned it off. Okay, cool. Yeah, so this is what Katie was mentioning. There is where the bee has packed its pollen. This is a great cue that you're looking at a female as opposed to a male because males will never have pollen on their legs. It's also a good cue for differentiating between cuckoo bumblebees and non-cuckoo bumblebees. If you see pollen on the legs, you know you're not looking at a cuckoo bumblebee. Yeah, and they will have all sorts of different colors packed on there sometimes. Generally, the pollen's going to be yellow, but sometimes you'll see green, sometimes you'll see purpley blue. It's really cool. Sometimes it almost looks like Play-Doh mixed up. They'll have like multicolored Technicolor pollen. So very fun to see the different colors they have.
And if you catch a bee and there's no pollen sac on there, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to determine if you're looking at a cuckoo bee or a male bee if you're new to this. And so maybe, Jenny, can you pull up a plain hind leg of a bumblebee? But where that pollen
Yes.
sac would be is like a triangle that has no hair on it. It's a very shiny area of the leg. So if you see that, you're probably looking at a female true bumblebee, not a cuckoo bee, not a male bee, because they're going to have that big area for pollen collecting.
Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen again.
Sounds good.
This is one of your photos, Jared. Look at that.
Oh, beautiful.
Right. So yeah, just as Katie was discussing it, that hind leg, that middle segment of the hind leg is going to be triangular in shape. You'll see like sort of the fringe of hairs that's curved inwards, almost like a little basket, right? Because it's a pollen basket. And then they will have no hairs in the center because that's where they put their pollen. It kind of almost is like a little shelf for them to put their pollen on. Yeah, so I guess just zooming out, what we're looking at, and when I say that that's the middle part of their hind leg is that part right there, that back leg, that middle bit, right? We're not looking at the very bottom, not at the very top, in between.
There's one last
Okay.
related question about carpenter bees having pollen sacs. They will be collecting pollen, but like everybody had discussed, their hind leg is more of a bottle brush. You're not going to see that blank, shiny triangular area. It's just going to be a hind leg covered in hairs. So when they collect pollen, it's sort of all around their hind leg, not in a nice, clean basket or sac.
Amazing. All right, I think we are at time right now. Thank you everybody for joining us today. It was really lovely to spend this hour with you talking about bumblebees. It's one of my favorite things to do personally, and I just want to acknowledge all the time and hard work you've put in just showing up to these webinars. All right, I think we are going to wrap up, but once again, thank you so much for being here with us.